Okay, so let's start off with understanding what public deficits are and what public debts are. Okay, so they're related, but they're not the same thing. So let's start with the government budget deficit. This is any time the government spends more money than it receives in taxes during a given period of time, and that difference is financed by selling government securities, which are called bonds. To equate this to a person or a household, this would be equivalent to a household or you yourself as an individual spending more money than you make. The only way to do that is to go into debt. And when you do that, it's called deficit spending. You're spending more than you make, and in order to finance the deficit, you have to go into debt. Okay, it's the same for the government. All right, so the federal deficit is a flow variable, right? So recall the difference between flow variables and stock variables. So deficits are flow variables. They're defined for a specific set period of time, usually 1 year. And if spending equals the tax revenues or tax receipts, then we say that the budget is balanced. The government's spending exactly what it earns or brings in tax revenue, so it has a balanced budget. But as is most often the case, when government spending exceeds receipts, we have a deficit. If it's the other case, which we haven't seen since the Bill Clinton administration in the late 90s, if receipts or tax revenues exceed expenditures, then we have what's called a surplus, a budget surplus. Okay, so for an individual or a household, this would be someone that's saving money, right? They're bringing in more income than they spend, and they save that difference. Okay, so again, a balanced budget is just a situation where spending exactly equals the total tax and revenues it collects given a set period of time, usually, again, 1 year. And the surplus is when the government is bringing in more money in taxes and revenues than it spends in a given period of year, again, usually a 1 year period. Now, contrast deficits and surpluses with debt. Debt is a stock variable, so it's not constrained to any particular amount of time. It's the accumulation of debts and surpluses. It's the accumulation of deficits and surpluses. So when we talk about the public debt, it's the total value of all outstanding federal government securities, what the government owes to the public, essentially, when it borrows money. Because when it does borrow money, when it doesn't have enough money for its expenditures, because it's spending more than it brings in taxes and other revenues, it has to borrow that, and it usually, for the most part, borrows it from the public by selling those bonds. And so what it owes to the public is called public debt. Now, since the 1940s, or since 1940, the U.S. federal government has operated with a budget surplus in only 13 years. So we're talking about almost basically 8 out of 80 years since 1940. Only in 13 of those years has it ever operated with a budget surplus. In all other years, so in all other, 67 years, the shortfall of tax revenues below expenditures has been financed with borrowing from the public. So graphically, we can take a look at how it's changed over time. So right around World War II, right, World War II was going on here. The purple or blue line is tax revenues, okay, receipts, and the red line is expenditures, so what the government is spending. So during World War II, the government was spending a lot of money on war. Okay, so that's why we see expenditures higher than receipts, and so there was a deficit here, right? So the deficit is increasing the public debt. And then immediately after World War II, for a long time, we were really close to a balanced budget, right? Not taking on a lot of debt. But then as we went on beyond, the mid-1960s, we saw more and more deficits, right? So here's another huge deficit. And then right here is that surplus during the Clinton administration in the late 90s, right around between 1998 and early 2000s, 2001, I think. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and the war on terror began, and we began spending more money than we were bringing in again. And then you'll notice this huge increase in expenditures while there was a dip in taxes. So that was the Great Recession, okay? And ever since then, we've just had huge deficit, which is increasing the debt, right? So again, recall that the deficit, the gap here, is a flow, and it's increasing the debt, which is a stock variable, right? And just in case you forgot, you can think of flows and stocks. Think of like a bathtub, right? The water flowing into the tub from the faucet as well as out of the drain. Those are flows, right? It's changing the amount of water in the tub, which is the stock. Okay, so think of it like that. Now, maybe I'll try and find this deficit picture for us currently. Now, I guess I can kind of estimate it here. So it looks like the latest estimate puts our deficit at around $500 billion, okay, which sounds like a lot. But in the last couple of months, because of this coronavirus thing, our deficit this year has ballooned to nearly $4 trillion. Okay, $4 trillion. So that $4 trillion is right there, that height. That's what our deficit has become in the past 2 months. Crazy, crazy. All right, here in this graph, we see the federal budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. So as we can see, it only goes back to 1970. So right here, we were near a balanced budget. We had some deficits, pretty small fraction of GDP, although getting bigger and bigger. Then we had the balanced budget here. We had the surplus, actually, we had the budget surplus here at the end of the Clinton administration. So it's a negative percentage of GDP. So we had excess cash, right? We were reducing our debt here at this point in time. But then it quickly went back up after 9/11 and then the Great Recession. Okay, so we're during the Great Recession, up near 10% of GDP. Currently at a $4 trillion deficit, that puts us at roughly 25% of GDP, maybe a little bit less, maybe 20%. So again, huge magnitudes as a result of this coronavirus. So here's a question to think about. Why has the government's budget recently slipped from a surplus of 2.5% in the late 90s into a deficit of more than 3% of GDP? And the answer is relatively simple. Spending has increased at a faster rate since the early 2000s after 9/11. And on top of that, tax rates have been reduced not only around 9/11 and shortly after, but also as a result of the Great Recession. So both of these things in combination, spending going up, taxes going down, that leads to a bigger deficit. All right, let's think about a policy example regarding budget deficits. So the increasing costs of student loan forgiveness are raising federal budget deficits. So in 2012, the government implemented a student loan forgiveness program, and its eligibility standards have been broadened since then, so more people are eligible for this forgiveness. And as a result, the federal government now incurs a cost of more than $20 billion per year, and this cost is anticipated to grow in future years. Now, $20 billion is a drop in the bucket compared to the $4 trillion deficit we've recently incurred, so this is definitely not as big of an issue as it used to seem. But this expense adds to the government's annual budget deficit and therefore increases the public debt. All right, and now a behavioral example. Will taxpayers eventually force government spending cuts? So behavioral economists have found that when ratios of taxes to national income reach a high threshold of about 25 to 35%, tax-paying voters begin to pay much closer attention to government spending levels. And these voters will then add pressures on their representatives in Congress and other government officials to eventually bring down government budget deficits and reduce the public debt, which we are going to have to do at some point.